Hi, my name is Dr. Rayshawn Ray, aiming to speak truth to power, and this is my daily thought. I debated conservatives on Twitter for about a week about gun control and other issues. And this is what I learned about their thoughts on democracy, free speech, and race. First, they really think that liberals want to take their guns away. Right now, don't get me wrong. There are some liberals who don't think anybody should have guns. Personally, being from Tennessee, people shoot guns, right? People have guns. People hunt. I don't understand why you need an AR-15 to potentially hunt a chicken in the middle of the day walking down a busy street. All right? Even besides that, I think the whole point is not to infringe on people's Second Amendment rights. However, it is to establish gun control that makes sense, right? And so part of the problem is that a lot of conservatives don't think that gun control actually works, when instead empirical research shows that while, yes, the number of guns that people have in their home, and I'm pretty sure that this is the mean and not the median. In other words, the number of guns per person rather than the median point of guns. I think it's some people who don't have any guns, some people who have quite a few guns, and it's kind of skewing the data. Regardless of that point either, I think the point is that research documents that states that have stricter gun laws have fewer gun deaths, right? And these aren't only deaths as it relates to crime in urban or impoverished communities. Instead, these are deaths related to children, right, who get guns. Instead, this is related to mass shootings, right? So we really have to pay attention to those sort of things. The next thing I learned is that conservatives feel like in this current climate, this current political and cultural climate, that they can't freedom. Yes, you heard me correct. That they can't freedom. They use freedom as a verb rather than a noun. Right? And so what they feel is that they actually can't speak candidly about the sort of things that are going on, and Donald Trump gives them a platform by which to do so. The other part of this is that they think blacks can speak candidly and they can't speak candidly, right? And they think that whites also have it bad. They think that whites are actually being discriminated against at a much higher rate than blacks actually are. And that's pretty interesting, right? They also think that all black people are like rappers, right? In other words, they think that black people are going around using certain types of language, going around potentially having a certain masculine bravado, when instead what they don't realize is this is all a facade. When these individuals make their money, the few that actually do make it to be extremely popular and successful, they go back to extremely wealthy neighborhoods, right, and drive nice vehicles and have business ventures, right? It's simply a facade. And I think that because a lot of individuals have limited interactions with blacks, they start to view black people as being that, right, instead of that just being a caricature related to media and those sorts of things. Next, they think that blacks didn't earn any of what they actually got, right? I faced that firsthand as it relates to statements related to the fact that I had to be an affirmative action baby, that I didn't earn anything that I actually got, that Memphis and Indiana and Maryland and Berkeley, that they were simply trying to fill quotas when I was either working there or getting a degree there. I was also asked who actually wrote my dissertation. I mean, all sorts of other things that we know that that's actually saying. And so part of this is the denial of empirical data. When you actually present people with empirical data, their cognitive dissonance goes on overload. And oftentimes what happens is that things become racial really quickly. And also the name calling oftentimes happens really, really quickly. The other thing is that they actually think that the reason why blacks benefit so much from affirmative action is because some of them would actually milk the system if the system was set up the way they think that it's set up for black people. In other words, they think the system is set up for black people to get things without necessarily working hard for anything, right? Instead of realizing that A, affirmative action isn't necessarily in place the way that it used to be. B, that quotas are actually illegal without oftentimes federal oversight, where there has been egregious forms of discrimination in place. And third, they don't realize that affirmative action simply allows people to get to the door. Fourth, that affirmative action actually benefited women more than minorities. And fifth, that affirmative action is put in place for several marginalized groups, not just black people or Latinos, right, or Native Americans, but also as it relates to gender, age, disability, national origin, right? I mean, several factors are put in place as it relates to affirmative action to try to make a more equitable society, to correct recent wrongs and things that have went on. The other part of this is that part of thinking about the milking the system is also that like Donald Trump essentially said that he hasn't paid taxes, right? And then a report just came out essentially highlighting that he hasn't paid taxes. He said that makes him smart. There are some conservatives who actually agree with that, right? And instead of realizing, as one of my colleagues said on Twitter, that if everyone was actually like Donald Trump, the United States would not be what it is today, right? Because people would not be paying taxes to actually fund all of the things that are supposed to be provided, related to education, related to streets, related to lighting, right? Even related to the police that conservatives really push a particular agenda about. The other thing that I found interesting when having these debates was that some conservatives thought that black professors give white students bad grades because if they were a professor, they would give black students bad grades because black students, it's no possible way they could keep up. So as a way to get back at white people, black professors give white students bad grades. I mean, I found this to be so ludicrous. I mean, some of the stuff, was so far off base that, it simply blew my mind. And then, of course, when their argument isn't working, they proceed to name calling, and I mentioned those sort of things. The major part related to this, though, is that like most Americans, like most people, right? This isn't a conservative characteristic, but they have a very simplistic view of race. Right? They can't necessarily view race as being something that's structural or institutional. The fact that racism can continue without individual racists existing, right? So they actually don't think that there is a lot of racism at all, right? They think that these are simply some bad apples that are doing things and that black people and other minorities are making a big deal about these sort of things, right? I guess it's a similar argument that people would make about the interactions between men and women, right? There's some kind of way women are making up the fact that of the type of sexual harassment and violence that they actually encounter when interacting with men in certain spaces, right? A certain level of microaggressions that go on. The other interesting part of this, though, is that the conservatives who I was interacting with on Twitter, the conservatives that I was interacting with on Twitter, felt that by mentioning race, that you are race baiting, that you are simply that you are then spewing hate, right? And so I found that interesting, right? That we actually need to disentangle the fact that you can have a conversation about race and it can potentially be racial without necessarily someone being racist in that interaction. And that's part of the problem, is that we aren't necessarily having the types of conversations that we need to have. And instead, the analysis that myself, along with some colleagues, Melissa Brown, Neil Freystadt, and Ed Summers have done on Twitter, we find that people are essentially having interactions in very different silos. And then when other people infiltrate those silos, it leads to a breach, right? That people don't necessarily know how to deal with a person coming into their space, into their silo, right? And having conversations that don't necessarily fulfill the status quo. The other thing, they actually think that slavery is black people's fault because some black people sold other black people into slavery, right? Instead of realizing that at the time, some people on one hand felt that people were getting sent into indentured servitude, and after, say, 7 or 13 years, that they would actually be let go and be given land like some whites were actually given in the 1600s, right? And in some case into the 1700s. But what they don't necessarily realize, even besides that, right, is that while slavery was nothing new to humanity, the racialization of slavery was indeed new, right? And Dr. Takufa Zuberi at UPenn has more or less talked about this, right? And so part of thinking about slavery is that many of them think that slavery wasn't that bad, right? When in fact slavery was hell, right? And they act like that it wasn't as bad as people are actually saying. So we really need to remind people and continuously regurgitate narratives about the glory that has existed on American soil, right? That is something that we're not really good at doing. The other part of this is that they don't understand stand your ground laws, right? And part of not understanding stand your ground laws is because they don't necessarily understand statistics, which is difficult to get, right? So part of this is not understanding that stand your ground laws are flawed and should actually be outlawed because simply because you fear someone, you shouldn't be able to take the law into your own hands. So what some conservatives think is that if a person stands their ground, it has to be that something was physically done to them. They don't understand that nothing had to be happening at all, that people simply had to feel threatened, and they could actually take the law into their own hands. They also think that black people are a monolith, right? This goes back to thinking all black people are rappers, and this has to do with the limited interactions that we have in society because we live in such highly segregated neighborhoods that our schools are segregated, our interactions are segregated, our churches are segregated, our friends are segregated. This is highly problematic, particularly in a high technology era where people actually are interacting in certain venues and certain spaces like in social media, but not in real life, right? And then they blame Black Lives Matter for police deaths. And this is the reason why they feel like they should get guns, right? So after mass shootings, one thing we would think is that people would pause on guns and say, okay, wait, hold up. A lot of kids just got killed in a school. How can we rectify this situation? Instead, there are some people, who are mostly Republican, who go out and purchase more guns, right? And so these are the sort of things I find interesting. And when it comes to mass shootings, several of these schools, as well as malls, have SRO, student resource officers, right? SRO officers, as well as officers at malls that don't stop these incidents from occurring, right? So we really need to put this in context. Finally, and one of the most problematic things is that the conservatives that I debated think that any crime justifies Black death. So they think that smoking weed or pushing somebody down or running away, that all of these things are justified and lead to a person being killed, right? They actually think that these sort of things are killable and justifiable. And the point is that people do a lot of bad things, right? Again, as I've talked about before, we're talking about 95% of black people, 95 out of 100 who never do anything in life, right? But of that 5%, similar to that 2.5% of whites, those who do certain things, it doesn't mean that what they've done necessarily means death, right? And I think that's the whole point. And so the point of this conversation, I learned a lot about how cognitive dissonance operates, about how people view freedom, about how people view race in America. And part of thinking about this then is that we need to have more conversations. And some people are like, well, I don't necessarily want to have conversations with people like that. That's fine. Coming from where I come from, I interact with a lot of people who have views like that. Doesn't mean they're bad people at all. What it does mean is that they might be highly uninformed, right? And part of this has to do with Fox News being the #1 news network. I talk to a lot of liberals, and many of them are appalled that Fox News is the #1 news network. I mean, it's not even close, right? So for my liberal friends, if you're not watching Fox News in some sort of way, then you are missing narratives that are important for having conversations with people who think differently than you. So conversations matter, right? And conversations matter like Black lives in books. And in some cases, I've had very insightful conversations with conservatives. And these were quite insightful and quite enlightening, and unfortunately, quite negative.